Bill Hader was seen stepping out for the first time since an alleged tense exchange with Nick Reiner ahead of the deaths of Rob and Michelle Reiner.
Hollywood sat in an eerie, choking silence for 9 days after it happened.
There's just devastation.
It must be gut-wrenching to learn how things turned out. I'm sure that night is replaying for him over and over again.
There were no press releases, no teary interviews, just a void where noise should have been. When the Reiner name dropped off every headline like it had never existed, the people who really pay attention knew something had gone very wrong.
According to a source, describes a tense interaction between Nick Reiner and Bill Hader.
One man noticed sooner than most. Bill Hader couldn't sleep after that night. Not after the look he got from Nick Reiner. It was the kind of look that doesn't come with a warning, but with a wait.
Nick interrupted a private conversation, was told it was private, stood silently, then stormed off.
A smile that didn't match the mood. A stare that lasted just a second too long. Nothing was said, but something was definitely off. For the first time, he's finally ready to talk about it. He's not here to accuse or speculate, just to say what he saw and how silence became louder than any shout.
We'll have those conversations, and then it's usually when we're paying the check. I'm here to tell you, I'm going through something. I'm really depressed, and should I go on medication?
What happened that night didn't explode. It sank slow and quiet into everyone's memory. We need to rewind because the moment this story starts, the ending was already on its way, and no one knew it yet. At first glance, there was nothing remarkable about the evening. It wasn't a red carpet event or some splashy Hollywood bash. Just a small private gathering with a few familiar faces from the industry. It was the kind of night that usually disappears once the lights go out, but this time it didn't. Somewhere between the casual chatter and the awkward small talk, something shifted. Witnesses described Nick Reiner as distracted and detached, almost like he was only halfway in the room. His words came in quick, strange bursts, followed by long silences. One moment, he would be asking people uncomfortable questions like, "Are you famous? What's your name?" And the next moment, he would be staring off into nothing like he was already gone. At least one person described it as scary. And from Hader's perspective, it was more than unsettling.
As of 2016, Nick had gone to rehab 18 times. And that means that in 7 years, he went to rehab 18 times.
According to multiple people, Bill arrived late that night, just as the mood in the room was starting to curdle. He tried to keep things light by cracking a few jokes and doing what he does best, but the laughter that followed didn't feel real. It came late and sounded forced. Every time his eyes met Nick's, something didn't sit right. There's a moment people keep circling back to. Nick, who had already been introduced to Bill by Rob Reiner earlier in the night, approached him again like they had never met. He asked Bill what his name was and whether he was famous. Bill didn't know how to respond, and that interaction stayed with him in a way no joke could erase because something about it felt wrong. But that wasn't the part that haunted him yet. What's strange is that no one thought much of it in the moment. Nights like that come and go in this city with weird energy and a few uncomfortable exchanges, then everyone moves on. But when the news broke 9 days later, that quiet, ordinary evening snapped into sharp focus.
It's an extraordinary financial expense. It may make life easier in some ways, but it doesn't necessarily make life better. So when you think about a family here who was trying everything over the course of a decade plus.
People close to the situation say that what happened later that night, after most guests had left and the house started to empty, was never officially accounted for. It wasn't on a schedule and it wasn't in anyone's timeline, but it mattered. Those last few hours were when the silence really began to take shape. Here's where everything you think you know about this story is about to change. While the media rushed to call it a mystery and moved on, those who were actually in that room have been carrying something much heavier. The man who said the least might have seen the most. As the night wore on, what started as awkwardness shifted into something heavier. You know that feeling when the air in the room gets too still, like everyone's waiting for something to happen but no one wants to admit it. That's what multiple guests described about the second half of that night. Conversations thinned, music got quieter, and somehow, despite the laughter and chatter, no one could shake the weight pressing in from the edges. Bill Hader was seen lingering by the doorway for a while, half listening and half somewhere else entirely. He wasn't the only one who noticed Nick Reiner drifting in and out of conversations, like a signal cutting in and out.
I mean, you were putting a lot of effort into dealing with this relationship, and for it to end so tragically and violently is very upsetting.
One person who was at the party said it felt like Nick was watching something no one else could see. He would engage just enough to not seem rude, then disconnect mid-sentence. His eyes would scan the room, land on someone, linger, then move on. More than once, guests reported a moment where Nick just stood silently nearby, saying nothing and not moving. Then, just like that, he would turn and walk away. That kind of behavior usually gets dismissed in Hollywood as quirky or intense, but looking back, it felt different. There was a moment late into the evening when Nick interrupted a private conversation. He was told it was a private chat, and instead of walking away, he just stood there, completely still and watching. Then, without a word, he stormed off. There was no shouting and no confrontation, just a sudden sharp exit that made everyone pause. It didn't seem like a big deal at the time, just another uncomfortable moment in a weird night, but it stuck with people, especially Bill, because moments like that started stacking up. Here's where things started to shift from uncomfortable to unforgettable.
Everything is gone. That was the thing that kind of hit me so hard, and that was horrible.
As the house began to empty out, people left in pairs almost without realizing it, one after another. There wasn't a big goodbye or a final toast, it was more like a quiet retreat. By the time only a few remained, Bill was among the last to leave. A friend remembers him standing at the gate, pausing for a second, then glancing back toward the house. They didn't think much of it in the moment, but in hindsight, that look, that pause, has become the image that won't go away. That's when you realize this wasn't just another awkward Hollywood hangout, this was a night where something cracked just a little, and the people who were paying attention felt it. What people didn't know at the time, what only surfaced later through fragments and first-hand recollections, was just how long this tension had been building before that night ever happened. According to those familiar with Nick Reiner's situation, this wasn't a sudden shift or a one-off episode. By 2016, Nick had already been to rehab 18 times in roughly 7 years. That alone tells you this wasn't a casual struggle or a short detour.
There was an awkward exchange made more awkward by the fact that he had met Hader earlier in the night. Rob had introduced him, so when he came up and asked him questions such as, "What's your name? Are you famous?" it was unsettling and described as scary from Hader's perspective.
That kind of cycle drains more than money, though the financial cost alone was described as extraordinary. It drains families, it drains patience, it drains hope. People close to the Reiners say the family had been trying everything over and over for more than a decade, doing what families do when someone they love keeps slipping away. That context matters because once you see it, that night doesn't feel random anymore. It feels like the surface tension finally breaking. Someone who knew Nick described him as going through something heavy at the time, openly admitting to being deeply depressed and questioning whether medication might help. Those weren't whispers, those were real concerns being voiced. Yet even with all that effort and all that intervention, the situation didn't stabilize. The result was a relationship dynamic stretched thin, where everyone was walking carefully and hoping nothing would snap. That's the part that makes the ending so hard to process. When something tragic and violent comes after years of effort, it leaves behind a specific kind of devastation, the kind that asks impossible questions with no satisfying answers.
Just saying, I just want to go home. It was tough, and I mean, that was the most heartbreaking thing.
During the party, he was approaching people there, asking questions that, in that context, seemed confrontational, strange. Well, there, are you famous? Bill Hader was one of the people he approached at the party.
When the news finally broke, it landed without detail. Headlines spoke in vague terms about loss, mourning, and reflection, but no explanations followed. Hollywood reacted by pulling inward. Meetings quietly canceled, calls postponed, publicists suddenly unavailable. People didn't even gossip the way they normally would. 9 days passed before Bill Hader said anything at all, and even then it wasn't the kind of statement people expected. There were no accusations and no dramatic reveals, just a man clearly haunted by a memory he couldn't shake. Friends said he kept replaying the night, going back over moments that didn't stand out at the time, but now felt impossible to ignore. Here's the twist that reframed everything. When Bill finally spoke, even briefly, he didn't describe violence, threats, or anything concrete. What he described was silence, a wrong kind of quiet, the kind that freezes a room for a heartbeat. It was the kind you dismiss because nothing technically happens, and that realization hit hard. Once you recognize that kind of silence, you start to wonder how many warning signs hide in plain sight, brushed off because they don't come with noise. That night wasn't violent in action, it was violent in absence. And once Bill understood that, he couldn't unsee it. Once the silence broke, it didn't explode. It seeped out slowly through side comments, half-remembered conversations, and moments people couldn't stop replaying in their heads. Those close to Bill Hader noticed the shift almost immediately. He still showed up to work, still hit his marks, still delivered lines, but something about his timing felt different. Between takes, he lingered longer than usual, staring off as if he had missed a cue only he could hear. One friend described it as distance, not grief in the traditional sense, but a thoughtful pause that never fully closed. He kept circling back to the same small details from that night, not the obvious moments, but the ones everyone else ignored, like the silence after a comment, or the way a room went still for a split second and then carried on like nothing happened. Behind the scenes, whispers picked up again. People weren't asking what happened, they were asking who noticed. According to those conversations, Bill wasn't alone in feeling unsettled, but he was one of the few willing to admit it, even quietly. He asked friends simple questions, the kind that sound harmless until you hear them repeated, like whether anyone else felt the mood shift or noticed how quickly people started leaving. None of those questions came with conclusions, they just hung there. That's when the realization settled in for him. This wasn't about a single moment, it was about a pattern of dismissing discomfort because it didn't come with an explanation. As the weeks passed, that realization only grew heavier. Bill withdrew from gatherings he normally wouldn't miss. People chalked it up to taking time, to grief, to exhaustion, and maybe all of that was true. But those closest to him described something else, a sense that he was carrying regret without knowing exactly what it was attached to. It wasn't regret for something he did, but for something he didn't say, didn't question, didn't push on when it felt easier to laugh it off. When he finally let a piece of that slip during a quiet podcast taping, mentioning a night that still sat in the back of his head, listeners felt the shift immediately. His voice slowed, his words became careful, and then he stopped himself, moved on, and left the meaning hanging. That moment changed how people heard the story. Suddenly, the focus wasn't on what happened later, it was on what happened before and how easily it blended into the background noise of Hollywood life. The peak of this story isn't a shocking reveal or a dramatic confession, it's the unsettling realization that sometimes the biggest warning signs don't announce themselves. They wait to be noticed, and by the time they are, it's already too late. When the news cycle moved on, the silence didn't. It settled into the spaces people stopped talking about, like the parties Bill Hader no longer attended, the projects he quietly stepped back from, and the way his name slowly drifted out of headlines, not with scandal, but with absence. Friends say he wasn't avoiding the spotlight out of shame or fear. It was more like he had nothing left to say. Something about that night hollowed out the usual rhythm of his life. While Hollywood is built to move on fast, those who paid attention could still feel the aftershock. In a town where image is everything, Bill didn't try to manage his, he just disappeared for a while, and maybe that said more than any interview ever could. What remains even now is that one haunting idea he reportedly told a friend. You never really know when someone's struggling, you just assume they're fine until they're not. That sentence never made it to a press release, and it wasn't part of any statement, but it found its way into conversations, articles, and quiet industry reflections. In a city obsessed with being seen, the things we miss are often the ones that matter most. The look that lasts too long, the laugh that comes too late, the question that shouldn't feel as threatening as it does. That night at the Reiner gathering had all of it, just scattered in pieces no one wanted to put together. Now, years later, the silence around that night is still intact. No official reports filled in the missing pieces, and no dramatic tell-all ever hit the stands. But something shifted in the people who were there, especially Bill. The man known for his timing, for knowing exactly how to land a moment, has since become quieter and more deliberate. Colleagues say he changed, not in some dramatic headline-grabbing way, but in the choices he makes now. He shows up and he works, but there's a weight that wasn't there before. In the spaces between scenes and between takes, you can almost feel the question he's still carrying about what he didn't see. This story doesn't end with closure. It doesn't wrap up neatly with a lesson or a breakthrough because that's not how silence works. It lingers and it infects memory. In this case, it's become a kind of ghost that follows the survivors, not just Bill, but everyone who was close enough to feel something shift that night, even if they couldn't name it. In Hollywood, where every story has a spin, this one never got one. It just stayed quiet, and somehow that made it louder. If you're still wondering what happened that night, you're not alone. The truth is that no one can say for sure, but what we do know is that in a place where everyone talks, sometimes the real story hides in what no one wants to say. This left you with questions, and that's where the story lives now, in the questions we're still too scared to ask.